Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
There are moments in television history that don't just change a show, they change everything around it. A single broadcast, a single sketch, a single laugh that lands the wrong way at exactly the wrong time in exactly the wrong cultural climate. For Benny Hill, that moment came quietly, almost without warning, nestled inside what seemed like just another evening of harmless fun. But nothing about what followed would be harmless, and nothing would ever quite be the same again. For more than 3 decades, Benny Hill had been one of the most recognizable faces on British television. His gap-toothed grin, his talent for disguise, his impeccable physical timing, these were the tools of a man who had dedicated his entire life to making people laugh. And for most of that life, it worked magnificently. The Benny Hill show wasn't just popular. At its peak in the early 1970s, it was pulling in audiences of over 21 million viewers in Britain alone, making it one of the most-watched programs the country had ever produced. Beyond British shores, it was broadcast in over 140 countries, turning this Southampton-born comedian into a genuinely global phenomenon. But fame of that magnitude has a peculiar fragility to it. The higher the pedestal, the more exposed the figure standing on top of it. And as the 1980s deepened, the cultural ground beneath Benny Hill's feet was shifting in ways that neither he nor Thames Television fully understood, or perhaps fully wanted to acknowledge. What had once felt like cheeky, harmless fun to millions of viewers was beginning to feel, to a growing and increasingly vocal segment of the public, like something else entirely. Something outdated. Something troubling. Something that needed to be stopped. This is the story of how one of British television's greatest comedy institutions came crashing down, and the infamous scene, the mounting controversies, and the forces of cultural change that finally sealed its fate. To understand what was lost, and why it was lost, you have to understand what Benny Hill had actually built over the course of his career. Because this wasn't a man who stumbled into success. This was a man who had been working toward it with extraordinary dedication since he was barely out of his teenage years. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born in Southampton in 1924 into a family with an unlikely streak of performance in its bloodline. His grandfather had been a circus clown. His father, by contrast, ran a surgical appliance shop, a grounded, practical man who had seemingly turned away from the family's theatrical roots. But those roots reached deep, and in young Alfred, they found fertile ground. From an early age, he was drawn to comedy, to performance, to the particular magic of making a room full of strangers laugh. He cycled through a remarkable variety of early jobs, working at Woolworths, driving a milk float, operating a bridge, playing drums in small venues. Each of these experiences, unglamorous as they were, fed something in him. They gave him characters, scenarios, a treasury of working-class English life that he would draw on for the rest of his career. When he eventually broke into entertainment, working first as an assistant stage manager with a touring revue and then during the Second World War performing for troops in the Combined Services Entertainment Division, he was already developing the timing, the instinct for an audience, the controlled chaos that would define his style. He adopted the stage name Benny as a tribute to his idol, the American comedian Jack Benny, whose deadpan delivery and immaculate comic timing he deeply admired. After the war, he moved steadily upward through radio and early television, and on January 15, 1955, The Benny Hill Show made its debut on the BBC. It was a landmark moment, though nobody knew quite how landmark at the time. The show's format drew consciously from the British music hall tradition, a vibrant, anything-goes style of entertainment that combined sketch comedy, song, physical gags, and larger-than-life characters. Hill was a natural fit for this world. His humor leaned on slapstick, wordplay, double entendres, and parody, wrapped up in an energy that felt simultaneously chaotic and precisely controlled. He was above all a craftsman. Every joke, every chase sequence, every piece of pratfall timing had been carefully thought through by a man who took his comedy extremely seriously even when the comedy itself appeared entirely frivolous. In 1969, the show moved from the BBC to Thames Television, and this transition marked the beginning of its most celebrated era. The format shifted to occasional one-hour specials rather than a weekly series, giving Hill more room to develop elaborate sketches and musical numbers. The production values climbed, the ambitions expanded, and the audiences followed in Britain and then across the world. What made the Benny Hill Show work so effectively for so long was a combination of elements that each reinforced the others. There was the physical comedy, Hill's extraordinary ability to transform his body, to chase and be chased, to communicate entire emotional landscapes through a raised eyebrow or a staggering run. There were the recurring characters, beloved figures like Fred Scuttle, a bumbling, saluting incompetent who became one of Hill's most enduring creations. There was the ensemble cast, performers like Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and the beloved Jackie Wright, whose bald head became the target of Hill's ritualized slapping gags in ways that audiences found endlessly, inexplicably funny. And then there were Hill's Angels. Introduced as the show evolved into the 1980s, Hill's Angels were a troupe of young women, glamorous, physically confident, present in both choreographed dance sequences and in the comedic sketches themselves. Their inclusion brought a new visual energy to the program and widened its appeal in certain directions. But it also made explicit something that had always been present in Hill's comedy, but had previously been more obliquely expressed: the show's fascination with female sexuality as a subject of comedy, pursuit, and spectacle. The women on the Benny Hill show were rarely portrayed as equals in the comedic landscape. They were, more often than not, the objects of the joke rather than its architects. They were chased. They were ogled. Their clothing was, by design, minimal. The humor surrounding them was rooted in the idea that men desired them helplessly and comically, and that this dynamic was inherently funny rather than potentially problematic. For most of the show's run, this formula sailed by without serious challenge. In the 1960s and much of the 1970s, the prevailing view among both audiences and critics was that this was simply the nature of light entertainment, bawdy, cheeky, essentially innocent. The wind was about to change direction entirely. In the late 1980s, a particular sketch aired that crystallized every criticism that had been building against the show for years. The sketch in question was a parody of a beauty pageant, a format that, in itself, was already beginning to attract serious feminist critique for its objectification of women. In Hill's version, the humor was centered on the contestants being ogled, assessed, and reduced entirely to their physical appearances, with jokes that many viewers found not merely unfunny, but genuinely offensive in their dismissiveness of women as full human beings. The sketch was not, by any objective measure, dramatically different from many other things the Benny Hill show had broadcast over the years. But context is everything in comedy, and by the time this sketch aired, the context had transformed completely. This was no longer the early 1970s, when 21 million people settled comfortably in front of their television sets for an uncomplicated evening of slapstick. This was a Britain that had been reshaped by years of feminist activism, by shifting cultural attitudes, by a new generation of comedians who were consciously building their work around an entirely different set of values. The sketch landed like a match thrown into dry tinder. Critics pounced. Letters arrived at Thames Television. The conversation that had been simmering for years suddenly boiled over, and the beauty pageant parody became the focal point for everything that a growing number of people found objectionable about Hill's approach to comedy. It was the moment that made cancellation feel, for the first time, genuinely possible. No account of the controversy surrounding the Benny Hill show's demise would be complete without examining the role played by Ben Elton, the young, fiercely political alternative comedian who became Hill's most prominent and most damaging critic. Elton was part of a new wave of British comedy that had emerged in the early 1980s, centered around venues like the Comedy Store in London, and propelled into mainstream consciousness by television programs like The Young Ones and Saturday Live. This alternative comedy movement was, at its core, a conscious rejection of the values that underpinned traditional light entertainment. Where the old guard had relied on stereotypes, racial minorities, women, gay people, the working class, as the subjects of easy, lazy jokes, the new comedians declared these targets off-limits and redirected their satirical energy toward the powerful rather than the vulnerable. Elton was one of the loudest and most articulate voices in this movement. And in 1987, he turned his attention squarely to Benny Hill. In comments made both on television, specifically on the influential program Saturday Live, and in the January 1987 issue of Q magazine, Elton made a striking and deeply serious accusation. He argued that the Benny Hill show was not merely outdated or tasteless, but was actively harmful, that by consistently portraying women as objects of male pursuit and desire, the show contributed to a cultural climate in which women felt unsafe in public spaces. He linked the show's imagery and comedy directly to real-world crimes and misdemeanors against women. It was a bold claim, and it detonated a fierce public debate. Defenders of Hill argued that the leap from a comedy show to real-world violence was absurd, a position articulated memorably in the pages of various publications. One commentator in The Independent described Elton's sustained attack on the aging comedian as resembling watching an elderly relative being set upon by aggressive young strangers, suggesting that whatever legitimate points Elton might have, the manner and venom of the attack were disproportionate and cruel. GQ magazine went further, comparing the logic of blaming a comedy show for societal violence to blaming concert pianists for unrelated catastrophes, an argument designed to highlight what they saw as the intellectual absurdity of Elton's position. But Elton's argument struck a deep chord with a significant portion of the public and, crucially, with the people who worked inside the television industry. The Broadcasting Standards Council added its institutional weight to the debate, with a spokesperson acknowledging that attitudes toward the kind of humor Hill specialized in had shifted fundamentally, that imagery, which had once seemed like harmless fun, was now widely perceived as offensive and degrading. The debate itself, regardless of where one stood within it, had achieved something that would prove fatal for the show. It had made the Benny Hill show a topic of controversy rather than simply a source of entertainment. Once a program becomes a political and cultural battleground, the simple pleasure of watching, it is poisoned. Viewers who might have watched without thinking now watched through a critical lens. Advertisers grew nervous. Executives at Thames Television began to ask uncomfortable questions about whether the association with the show was still worth the reputational cost. In a delicious and rather telling footnote to all of this, Ben Elton would later be invited to satirize himself and his own crusade in the comedy series Harry Enfield and Chums, appearing as a character called Benny Elton, a pompous, politically correct killjoy who, in a wonderfully circular piece of comedy, ends up being chased by a group of angry women to the sound of yakety sax. It was the kind of joke that worked on multiple levels simultaneously, acknowledging that Elton's campaign had perhaps occasionally tipped into self-parody, while still not entirely invalidating his underlying point. The controversy ignited by that beauty pageant sketch and fueled by Elton's public attacks did not cancel the Benny Hill show on its own. Cancellation rarely has a single cause. What it does have is a tipping point, a moment when the various pressures that have been building finally accumulate into an unstoppable momentum. At Thames Television, that tipping point arrived in 1989. The official reasons cited for the cancellation were primarily financial and practical. The show had become extraordinarily expensive to produce, with each episode reportedly costing in the region of £450,000, a figure that, adjusted for inflation, represents well over £1 million in contemporary terms. For a show that had once commanded audiences of over 20 million, those costs had been entirely justifiable. But audience numbers had been declining steadily through the late 1980s. The viewers who had once gathered in enormous numbers for Benny Hill were not deserting him en masse, but enough of them were drifting away toward newer programs, newer sensibilities, a television landscape that was rapidly diversifying and fragmenting, that the mathematics of the situation had changed. When declining viewership reduces advertising revenues while production costs remain high, the business case for continuing a show begins to collapse. The executives at Thames could look at their spreadsheets and find perfectly rational, numbers-based justifications for the decision they were already leaning toward for cultural and reputational reasons. Benny Hill, for his part, did not go quietly, but neither did he go loudly. His departure from Thames Television in late May 1989 was announced with a certain dignity, though those close to him suggested that the cancellation had wounded him more deeply than he was willing to admit publicly. He had, after all, spent 21 years building the Thames version of his show into something genuinely remarkable. He had earned the company an estimated £26 million, much of it through the show's extraordinary success in the American market, where it had been syndicated across networks and earned Emmy Award nominations in 1980 and 1981. To have that relationship ended in this way, not with a celebration of what had been achieved, but with a quiet administrative decision driven partly by the desire to distance the network from controversy, must have felt like a particular kind of betrayal. The years that followed were not kind to Benny Hill. He attempted to move forward with new projects, most notably an ambitious concept called Benny Hill's World Tour, which would have seen him performing comedy in the international locations where his show had been most beloved. The project never fully materialized. Only one episode was completed, a special title Greetings from New York, featuring familiar faces from the old cast including Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Sue Upton. It would be billed upon its eventual DVD release as his final television appearance. His health deteriorated. He had lived alone throughout his adult life, never married, though he had proposed to at least 2 women, including actress Annette Andre, who declined his proposal in the early 1960s. Despite his enormous wealth, he lived with remarkable modesty,